I'm really thrilled to have our speaker today. He's Dr. Andrew Rumbach. He's a policy fellow at the Urban Institute. Andy and his team, they conduct policy research on hazards and disasters in the U.S. It's part of Andy's sort of long-term research approach that looks at how policy at local, state, and federal levels intersect with themes of climate adaptation, hazard mitigation, and disaster recovery. I first, I met so many different academics, but I think the way I met Andy was a little bit different. I did some study, and it turned out there's some finding on flooding in mobile homes, and I started looking for more information, and he had such great research on it in an area that I think has gained more prominence in recent years. And so that's how we kind of struck up a conversation. I was really impressed with his work. So I'm just thrilled that he accepted our invitation to come today and share his knowledge on sort of the contemporary policy environment intersections with natural hazards and their societal impact. So please join me in welcoming Andy.
Hello. All right, I've got two microphones. Hopefully they're both working. So thank you, Dr. Tate, for the invitation. And we were talking about what I should talk about today. And I said, oh, should I talk about this study or that study? Kind of the traditional, academic presentation of a study where we go in depth. And he said, why don't you talk more broadly about who you are and what you do and where you fit in? And so I really took that opportunity. So this is going to be a little bit of a different kind of talk. I'm going to sort of talk about myself a little bit first, how I went from academia over to a policy think tank. And then I'm going to talk about 3 different research studies. I'm going to give you a little introduction to each of them. So hopefully it all ties together in the end, but it all kind of connects with this theme of how do we be effective as researchers today in this environment that is, suffice it to say, interesting times. How do we actually be effective even with what's happening at the federal, state, and local level, which is fairly unprecedented, especially for those of us who care a lot about climate and the environment. So just a little bit about myself. So I was a master's student in 2005. I just started graduate school, thought I wanted to do real estate development for a profession, and Hurricane Katrina hit, and I was fortunate enough to be at a program with one of the best community development scholars in the country who deeply involved in local level organizing, especially around Black wealth preservation, organizing of Black households. He said, Katrina is really important. We're going to connect our students and our university with Acorn and Acorn Housing, who, for those of you who don't know Acorn, at the time, they were the largest membership organization of Black households in New Orleans, where Katrina, the epicenter of Katrina was, at least from an urban perspective. And so I went down to Katrina, spent the next several years working on neighborhood level recovery with Acorn, especially in the lower 9th and the 9th wards. Eventually we were hired to do the recovery plans for that part of the city. And that kind of, ever since then, it's been 20 years, a few weeks ago, I've been doing research on disasters, and especially really the intersection of catastrophic disasters and where people live. The local experiences of disasters, how people prepare for them or don't prepare for them, how they recover afterwards, and increasingly how the policy environment meets their needs or doesn't meet their needs and why. So I've done work all over the world. I actually did my dissertation and most of my doctoral work in South Asia, focusing in one state in India, and have since then had an opportunity. I taught at the University of Hawaii, was at the University of Colorado for many years, and then at Texas A&M. And so had a long, fortunate experience to work a lot of disasters up close, and that continues to be the sort of through line of all of my research today. And so for me, things get really complicated in life when you're a PhD student and an assistant professor. Eventually you get old enough where things get simple again. Everything I do is basically 2 questions. Why do hazards and disasters affect people differently, people in communities? And then what can we do with public policy to protect underserved people? That's really, at the end of the day, that's what I care about. That's what my research focuses on. And these are questions that people have been asking for a very long time, and we're very far away from. We may have some of the answers, but especially the second one, what can policy actually do? I think we're still pretty far away from answering. So a couple of years ago, I had gone to Texas A&M. I was a tenured professor. I was the chair of the planning program. And I got a really unexpected offer to come to Washington, D.C. and join a policy think tank and help start a climate program. At first I was, at first I thought, oh, that's an interesting opportunity. But the more I thought about it and the place I was in my career, it really began to appeal to me. And ultimately, I made that decision to leave and I joined the Urban Institute. So I just want to give a little bit of information on the Urban Institute as an example of the kind of think tanks that are in Washington. So Urban was founded by Lyndon Johnson. The story goes, he was sort of jealous of, the war on communism had all of its think tanks associated with. McNamara had all his whiz kids running around. Johnson wanted a think tank for the war on poverty. He wanted somewhere where we could do concentrated social science research on the impacts of the anti-poverty programs that he was putting through Congress, and he started the Urban Institute. And since then, it's grown much larger, much more complex. Today, we have about 500 staff and works all across different areas of social policy, from budget and tax all the way to housing, and in my area, climate and communities. And so I am the co-lead of a part of Urban called Climate and Communities Program. This is about 10 or 12 of us who work together on an everyday basis full time, and then we interact and collaborate with a couple dozen more around the Institute. And we have 6 big strategic goals. This is what we all hope to accomplish by the time we leave the Urban Institute or leave this world. And really 3 of them I work on really carefully. So we're trying to recover equitably after disasters. That means that people all have a chance to recover regardless of who they are or what circumstances they found themselves in. We're trying to democratize climate data and decision making. I know that this is something that Dr. Tate cares deeply about, and we draw a lot on work like his and others. And also I work a lot on building safe and resilient housing. But like many organizations that do interconnected climate work, we also have focuses on things like how do we achieve a just transition to a clean energy economy. My colleague Sarah McTarnahan works really carefully on questions of how do we advance a climate safety net? What would it mean to have a social security program, for example, that took into account disasters? These kind of big questions, as well as one on regional resilience. So a lot of work going on at Urban related to climate and disasters. But today I wanted to focus on just a few that I think are relevant to the current moment we're in. Before I get to that, I did want to speak, this has been on my mind now for years since I joined Urban, trying to put this into words, and I'm still working on it, and I'm going to continue to evolve it. But this question comes up all the time. Why did you leave academia to go to a policy think tank? And I feel like I speak from both sides now. I know how strange and wonderful academics are. I also know how strange and wonderful think tanks are. I've met a lot of agency scientists, and I think a lot of folks think of this sort of incorrectly. And especially I think my academic friends and colleagues often think about us all as part of the same group. And this job is better than that job. Why would you go from a prestigious university to this? Or why would you go from an agency to that? I think trying to think much more about it now as an ecosystem. And an ecosystem that honestly we all need to learn more about each other and what we do, and to be more comfortable in the fact that we all are contributing to this sort of centralized goal. I heard somebody say, it's probably a famous saying, that no one's in charge of an ecosystem, everyone just tends it, and you try to be it's like a garden, you try to tend it well, but no one gets to say what the ecosystem does. It sort of moves on its own. And I see academia, as well as think tanks like ours, as part of this larger disaster research ecosystem that exists. And by the way, we're not the only parts of it. There's a huge amount of agency science that goes on. People who've spent their entire career, or maybe you're visiting agencies doing really great applied and basic research on disasters. We also have advocacy organizations that have dedicated research and researchers doing really amazing work. And we all contribute to this sort of center of the circle around disaster research. And I think that, and I can come back to this in the questions if anyone's interested in talking more about it, we bring different strengths to the ecosystem. And often where we find ourselves in trouble is where we want our strengths to be something than they are. And we want to do things that maybe we're not quite strong at. And I think that that's a lot of what I see as my job, is trying to help show people where they can be most effective at policy impact, even if they're at a place where doing some of the day-to-day stuff that I do doesn't fit well within their own work environment or the reward structure that they have set up in a place like a university. So we can come back to that. But now I want to kind of talk a little bit. Okay, so I went from academia, where I was publishing articles, a lot of peer-reviewed science, which is fantastic, looking for citations, looking for great education, to a policy think tank where my entire evaluation is how impactful are you? And we can judge impact at Urban on how impactful are you on communities that you intend to improve their lives, how impactful are you on the policy environment, state, local, federal, how impactful are you on your colleagues in terms of building a great work environment, but it's all about impact. If I publish a peer-reviewed journal article and it's impactful, fantastic, that is rewarded. But if I do something else that's impactful, that has nothing to do with peer-reviewed science, that's also rewarded. And that's been a real mind shift for me, kind of going into this different part of the ecosystem. And part of what I am focusing on now, and I wanted to give a little bit of a preamble for before talking about specific projects, is how can you be impactful in this moment in time that we find ourselves in, the last 6 months or 8 months or however long it's been since the change in administrations. And I know I can't go nearly deep enough into this. Some of you know exactly what I'm talking about. Some of you probably don't know at all what I'm talking about. But it's fair to say that within the disaster world, agencies, organizations that care about what happens before, during, and after disasters, it is a time of significant uncertainty happening right now. We have big changes happening at the federal level. We have Project 2025 gets published ahead of the election. It envisions a world where we get rid of a lot of the federal work on disasters and we return a lot of that to the state and local governments, or we privatize it, get rid of it altogether. It proposes things like getting rid of the National Flood Insurance Program, which is a cornerstone of our sort of social safety net for flood management. You also have President Trump comes into office. Unlike his first term, where he was actually fairly, we could talk more about it, but he did a lot of good things. Well, FEMA did a lot of good things during that, and it was certainly not a period of disruption. It was a period of growth. But he comes in his second term and is very quickly talking about getting rid of FEMA and using language like getting rid of FEMA, which is new and unique to this moment. And he impanels a group that's looking at FEMA reform that's led by many Republican and conservative leaders like the Greg Abbott from Texas, just blanked on his name, but the emergency management director, Kevin Guthrie for Florida, who's very likely the next FEMA administrator, et cetera. So there's that going on as well. And then you also have Congress, the House specifically, just passed out of committee, not the full House, but out of committee came a major piece of legislation reforming FEMA, and it was passed out of committee on a 58-2 vote. So major bipartisan support for a pretty significant, probably the most significant piece of legislation about FEMA since Hurricane Katrina. So you have all of these things happening at the same time. As well as funding cuts and programs being shut down, et cetera. But I think there's a few things that really, the through line of all of these that I think is relevant to the moment we're in. Number one is there's a big appetite for reforming the way we deal with disasters. And people have different opinions on how we reform, but a feeling that we need to reform. That's number one, and I think that goes through all these. There's a real focus across all of these on what's the appropriate role of the federal government. We have a system right now that I think it's fair to say a lot of people have criticized, including myself, as the federal government pays a lot of money for disasters, and we let state and local governments off the hook a lot for their decisions. And so again, if you sit in one of these camps, you have a very different opinion of where you follow that thought to. But this idea that we should have more responsibility at the state and local level kind of follows through all of these reform efforts. I think across all of them, you have real potential for advancement and innovation at the state and local level. Whatever you think of the policy, getting rid of the National Flood Insurance Program would drive a lot of innovation state and local, because they're going to suddenly have to make some really tough decisions. But same with this bill, same with the reform that the president is proposing. You also, the flip side of that is you have huge potential for inefficiencies, inequities, corruption, and mismanagement at the state and local level, which is why we had FEMA formed in the first place. We had 50 different disaster management fiefdoms happening all around the country, very inefficient, and a lot of things, if you lived in one state, you were much better off in a disaster than if you lived in another state, and the whole idea was to kind of create a single experience that people would have and a set of resources that they could rely on. I think another through line, at least especially for the more conservative side, the president and the Project 2025 vision, is certainly a reduced federal capacity and transparency over the next 3 years. I think we can expect that no matter what. And so I'll add all of that together. The key question I'm going to talk about today, as I talk about a few specific things we're doing at Urban, is okay, in this moment where there's reform is on the mind, a lot of people agree that we need to reform things on both sides of the aisle. I think there's actual legitimate room and space for debate, evidence, et cetera. And there's also, to be honest, a sort of attack on climate, an attack on certain parts of the research. All of that's happening at the same time. How can researchers be impactful in this moment? How can we avoid just going all back to our offices for the next 3 years and say, oh, well, we'll deal this once we have a chance again, right? That's not, Acorn would never let that happen, right? Any community organizer would not let that happen. You don't retreat to your offices when things get bad. You figure out how can you make change in the environment you're in. And I think that that's something that researchers would be good to adopt that attitude as well. Okay, so I want to talk about 3 ways that we're trying to be effective. This is part, I get to research 100% of the time now, so we're doing a lot of different things. But I'm going to talk about 3 projects, all very collaborative, that I think we're trying to be impactful in different ways in this moment. So first is, and I'm going to do each of these in about 7 minutes. And so no depth, all breadth. Happy to follow up with the peer-reviewed journal articles, all the details, the technical appendices, whatever. First one is a study of the Marshall Fire in Colorado that happened a couple of years ago. This is a collaboration with my colleagues at Duke, University of Colorado, as well as our folks here at Urban. So the Marshall Fire, until the LA fires, was probably the worst urban fire in the United States in 100 years. Happened around Christmas time, which is very strange to have a December wildfire in Colorado, but within 2 hours burned down over 1,400 homes in the suburbs of Denver. Anyone here from Colorado knows this is sort of halfway between Denver and Boulder. You have the towns of Louisville and Superior, as well as unincorporated Boulder County. Wildfire rages through, burned down the Costco, if that gives you an idea of the neighborhoods we're talking about around there. And so, as the fire was unfolding, we had a conversation going on X or Twitter or whatever it's called with my colleagues in the private chat saying, and they're in place, one of our colleagues who's on this team, she lives in Louisville, her husband's on the city council. They didn't lose their house, but all their neighbors did. She's part of this conversation. We started to say, okay, we're gonna do some research here once this fire stops. What are we gonna do research on? And what really drove our conversation that day was saying, you know, this is one of the most climate progressive communities in the country, this area, that's deeply committed to sustainability, resiliency, et cetera. But now they've had a disaster. And disaster theory tells us that they're probably going to become more conservative in their viewpoints once they actually have to deal with recovery. Why don't we ask about that? Why don't we say, is this fire going to strengthen their resolve, or is it going to erode some of the public support for policies that make it more costly, for example, to rebuild because you have to build to higher standards than you would have had to build before? And second, people who actually gone through this disaster, how are they able to shape these public policies? Are they actually able to participate? Who participates and why in this community? So those are our 2 basic research questions. We set up and we put out a survey. We're about to launch our 4th wave. So we've had 3 waves now, 3 complete waves. So this is longitudinal research on household level recovery, starting back about 6 months after the fire, and every 6 months since then, 6 to 9 months since then, we've been collecting a lot of data from households. And so this looks a lot like other household surveys of disaster recovery. I think the longitudinal part's very interesting. The research questions are interesting. I think what sets this one apart is, A, how deeply embedded we are in the community with this research. And there's a whole story to tell about this, but basically because of our colleagues in Colorado, who we stood up very fast, and they stood up very fast and said, hey, all of you researchers out there who are about to bombard my community with your surveys, no, we're all gonna come in one survey and do it together. So there's one survey, and that's what we ended up doing. We got 45 different researchers to come together and do one survey instrument. And as a result, we have incredibly high response rates. Over 70% response rates, where the average these days is about 12% for these kind of studies. So we have a fantastic data. Second, and this is really important, we have really embedded our research within the recovery context, in the sense that we've worked from day one with long-term recovery groups to talk to them, to vet our survey through, to talk about the purposes of the survey, to really make sure that the survey results are serving their needs, not just the needs of our academic research. We've also been in really close touch with the elected officials and they've used the survey results to actually guide policy in a way that I think is fairly unique. And so this is the sort of the broader theme here is impacting through actual community embedded science, which I know many of us already do, but this is a moment to sort of double down on these efforts to really be involved at the state and local level, because that's where policy is still happening no matter what's happening at the federal level. Let me tell you about a couple interesting findings that may sort of whet your appetite for reading more about this research. Not surprising, this is basically, we asked people how likely are they to want to return. This is 6 months after the disaster when all of their homes were destroyed. Not surprising, cost was the most important thing guiding people's decision making. If I can afford it was number one thing. Not at all surprising in a place where the housing costs are out of control like other parts of the country. I do think another really interesting part of this that we've continued to explore a little bit has to do with both retirement and time. And so retirement was all about, if you know this area, you know that unincorporated Boulder County has relatively older households. People have been around for a long time, more like homesteaders, big properties. People really worry about, oh, I'm in my retirement now. Do I really want to go through a disaster recovery? I might just want to sell this property and move on and enjoy my retirement years and not deal with the bureaucracy that's happening. That was a really important finding that we've continued to, we're going to build hopefully into a next generation of research specifically around retirees. And then second, and this is, again, we all know it, but it's great to be able to provide data to decision makers. The length of time it takes to recover, i.e. how long our federal policies take to result in things, drives people's decisions. They say if it can be done within a year, I'm good, but after that, my kids need to be back in a stable environment, et cetera, et cetera. This came out crystal clear, and over time, it's really interesting to see in the longitudinal sample who continues to focus on time versus those who either move away or stay in the sample. There's a lot of lessons there. To our very first research question, would people's attitude towards recovery or resiliency policy stay the same? This has been a fascinating example of, yes, people strongly support adopting resilient land policy changes to make our community stronger in its land use policies to future wildfires. 79% in wave 1, 83% in wave 2 in the town of Louisville. Similar numbers in all three of these places, right? People are strongly in support of upgrading our land policy to be stronger about wildfires in the future. But only if it applies to people in the future, not to ourselves who are recovering right now. And there's a lot of nuance in that statement, but this is the only disaster recovery where there was literal protest with people holding signs over clean energy policy. People were protesting the adoption of clean energy building codes because they saw it as a barrier to return. That became the political flashpoint in this recovery. People were outraged that the government might impose upon them higher building standards that made it more difficult to return and rebuild. And there's a ton of lessons in there that we're writing about now and that they've adopted locally, but there's a ton to learn there about how to message post-disaster in the recovery, the value of doing things ahead of time rather than afterwards, et cetera. There's a ton of learning there, but bottom line, people were very supportive of resiliency policies as long as it wasn't a barrier to them and their neighbors rebuilding. And unfortunately, when you're in a city that's built out, and you just lost 1,200 homes, the largest chance you're ever going to have to improve the resiliency of the built environment is in the rebuilding of those homes. Same thing in Los Angeles right now. You don't lose 15,000 homes in Los Angeles very often. When you rebuild them, are people going to accept the fact that we may rebuild to a different standard that's going to be more expensive and going to save us money and time? Every researcher in the world might say yes, but they're not in charge. People on the ground who are elected are in charge, and they are hearing from people at the grocery store and in their meetings, and people are outraged. There's a lot of lessons there about how to communicate these things to elected officials and to the public. Last point on this before I go on to the next project. This is the part that I have been very involved with. We published a blog on it, which is why we have this sudden change in graphics, but I'll share some links after this talk. I just want to say I'm part of my research is all about that idea of democratizing decision-making, who actually participates in disaster meetings. I've been to thousands of them for thousands of hours, and I can tell you it's not representative of the community, right? It's the same people who participate in all meetings, right? Wealthier, older, white people, generally, not always, but generally, often who have access to grind or have a deep involvement in that single policy issue, but don't represent the overall voter, right? We know that in every area of local policy, including housing, that meetings are not representative of the community. That became very true after the Marshall Fire. If you were low income, you were less likely to attend a recovery meeting by a pretty significant margin compared to people who are higher income. Therefore, the theory would go, the policy environment really reflected the needs of wealthier households than it did poorer households without specific intervention on poorer households' behalf. We have a paper that's coming out in Natural Hazards Review in a week or two, hopefully. We have some multivariate regression analysis asking this question of which variables associate with participating in recovery meetings. We asked people this over years. And over time, what predicted whether or not you continued to participate in these recovery meetings that were guiding the actual policies of recovery? Two things said, yes, you participated more than average. Whether you had a home that was completely destroyed or a home that was damaged enough where you were out of it. So you were deeply impacted by the disaster. It makes total sense, right? What was the number one, the only thing that really predicted not when you controlled for income, whether you were a renter or not? So that's another key finding from this study that we're continuing to follow up on is renters were systematically excluded in a lot of ways from these recovery decision making, which tracks with the literature overall, and we don't have a whole lot of data on. And this is a study that's starting to provide some of that data that renters tend to be not involved in the decision making process, and often the results of recovery policy favor homeowners over renters. Okay, that's number one. I got two more. So that's being effective through really engaging deeply locally. And all of these results, by the way, we've gone and done presentations to the city council, we've answered questions, we've held community webinars and meetings, we've gone to the long-term, right? We've been out in the community constantly with these findings. It's been, I think, especially because of Katie Dickinson, I give all the credit to her, that woman who's there locally, who's a professor at the Colorado School of Public Health. She's been sort of relentlessly local with this research, and it continues to show. Second one is disaster rapid response for local change makers. I don't even know if I'm going to call this research or not, and I'll say why. But it's a project that we're doing right now that is, I think, is proving to be really effective in this political moment. So this is the pitch that when we were thinking of this project that we sort of put out there, and anyone who studies disaster research, this is going to look familiar. We've always talked about disasters as focusing events for public policy, right? There's very few things that get everyone rallied around an idea for a moment, but disasters are one of them. When disasters happen, people intensely focus on disasters as a policy issue, and there's a window that opens up where advancements can happen that wouldn't otherwise happen. And there's been lots of good research on this. Tom Birkeland did a lot of the original research. His students have done it over the years. New coalitions emerge that couldn't exist otherwise, but disasters open up the space for them. Innovation happens that doesn't happen, et cetera. And so they're a focusing event, but, and this is what we've been really observing, or I've been observing, this really comes out of my own experience, I find that in the moment around disasters, the information environment's actually pretty poor. Especially in the few days or weeks after disaster, the information environment tends to be really lacking, and therefore that conversation that's happening in the very early days is often completely out of step with some of the main issues that should be addressed. And I kind of break it down into a little bit of, you need to have all three of these to be a good messenger of information in 2 days after disaster. It needs to be the right time, that window that's open. You need to be the right person. You have to have some credibility to be speaking about what you're speaking about, which I think all of us in this room probably do, right? You also have to have right information and evidence, and this is often what's lacking. People either come in and they say, Professor Tate, we've just had a flood in wherever, Washington, and Professor Tate gives a quote because he doesn't know anything about this place in Washington, but he talks generally about social vulnerability, and how, right? So it adds to the story, but it doesn't really drive the narrative at all. It doesn't focus in on what happened in this particular disaster that could be really important to policy, because he doesn't have the right data and evidence right in front of him unless it happened somewhere that the information environment is just really rich, like Los Angeles. So what can we do about that? So what we decided to do is, okay, an organization like Urban, we have the latitude as researchers. We don't have to be doing peer-reviewed science all the time. We can be doing responsive research. We have data scientists galore. Why don't we put together an information system ahead of time where we take all the best theory of disasters, we connect that to data that's available nationally at different scales, and we prepare the code, we clean the data, we make all of it available, and we also attach some of the key messages to it. And then when the disaster does happen, we can actually run those analyses and say something about the local environment that's actually happened. And there's kind of two theories of change that happen with that. One is that we're actually providing information to media organizations that drive the narrative locally. We're able to connect with reporters and say, hey, our data shows that mobile homes are going to be really important in this disaster because they're overrepresented in the flood area, and researchers show that they have a really hard time recovering. You should really maybe do some reporting on mobile homes, or whatever the policy issue is. But we also want to provide just-in-time information to decision makers on the ground who are, I talk to them all the time, they have no idea what's going on. 3 months from now, they're going to have an idea what's going on, but by then it's too late to shape some of these opinions because everyone moved on. In this moment, though, they could really use someone who says, hey, I pulled this data for you, here it is. These are 3 things that you might want to be looking at that are really important, and call me back if you have any questions, right? And we could do both of these things as a policy research organization. And so we designed a system, I don't know what I call it. We've spent hundreds or thousands of hours now putting together data from all kinds of different sources. We've been focusing on housing and socioeconomic status, but we're also doing some economic development indicators. We're doing some health indicators. Data from all kinds of sources, not just census, but many others as well, public and private. And we've prepared that data. We've aligned it with key understandings from the research literature and created a system for being able to rapidly analyze that data in place. When a disaster happens, we can select all the counties or census tracts, and we can provide a bunch of data on that place. We then do some kind of publication really rapidly with our communications staff to get those key messages out there on Urban's website. And then the coverage tends to happen in the 1 or 2 weeks afterwards. I should have said coverage and engagement with local decision makers happens about a week to 2 weeks afterwards. And it's been, honestly, not to toot my own horn a little bit, but it's been really effective so far what we've done. If you read the New York Times story after Hurricane Helene about mobile homes and disasters, we spent 24 hours with the New York Times helping them understand that story and report on it. I think I show up in the story as a one quote, but like the amount of time we were able to do behind the scenes with them to help shape that story and get it right from a science perspective was incredible. The Wall Street Journal, I mean, all of these outlets that have been reaching out and use our data, not just at the national press, but also these local ones like Mississippi Today, which has one reporter doing work on the West Fork tornadoes who doesn't have any data capacity at all, and we were able to provide him the data for his reporting. All of these examples where we're able to connect with reporters and we're able to say, here's what the science says, here's what the data locally says, here's what we think is important. And we're doing the same thing with local decision makers. After Helene, for example, we met with the resilience officers from multiple states. We've met with local governor or local mayors, city council members, et cetera, to talk to them about the events. So being impactful by bringing highly rigorous data and evidence to bear on a disaster as it happens, I think is another way to be effective, is that we're going beyond the platitudes in the event, and we're really driving the message towards the key things that we know. 1 week after the disaster, we still know that affordable housing is going to be a huge issue 2 years down the road. Let's get that on the conversation when everyone's paying attention, because that's an opportunity for policymakers to actually start thinking about that earlier rather than later. Okay, number 3. So this is a third one, and this speaks to how do we try to hit bipartisan policy agreement when it happens, the rare bird that emerges sometimes in these moments. And this is all about, which has been my own personal passion for years now, and Eric talked about during the intro around mobile and manufactured housing. We're in a moment right now where suddenly people care about this, and we're trying to take every advantage we can of this moment. So I want to talk a little bit about a report that we just published and a sort of area of research that we're really trying to invest in, which is about mobile and manufactured housing. I always start talking about this by talking about someone I've met along the way why I became interested in this topic. I think it's fair to say if you're anything like most people I've talked to in this country, especially those who are students and faculty at Princeton, you probably don't know a whole lot about mobile and manufactured housing. I'm guessing. Some of you might, but many of you don't. It is not a housing type that's at the top of our mind in this country very much. But it's 6% of our housing stock, and a tremendous number of low-income people in the country live in it. And especially in some states, it's 20% of the housing stock. In 2013, we had a huge flood in Colorado. devastated a bunch of communities. I became deeply involved in the recovery of one town for many years called Lyons. And I was doing, in the days after the flood, I was doing surveys of people who'd been impacted to try to get a sense of what was happening on the ground. And I met Donna Boone she was sleeping on the floor of her hair salon in downtown Lyons on Main Street. She had broken her ankle and was sleeping on the floor of her hair salon, and she had lost her mobile home, had been washed away in the flood. There was 2 mobile home parks in this town of Lyons, which was is a funky town that had been always artists and whatever, but in recent years has become like a suburb of Boulder and become crazy expensive, unaffordable to anyone who's not working at the university or working at Google or whatever else. So Donna lived in one of these mobile home parks, and she was having a really hard time with her recovery. She could not get them to give her housing vouchers because they said, your home is fine. Well, she said, yeah, my mobile home is fine, but the park is closed because the rest of it got destroyed. Well, they said, well, your home is fine. You should be able to stay there. She's like, the park's closed. They didn't understand the issue she was facing. And I talked to a dozen other people those weeks who lived in those mobile home parks who were all having this huge issue of not being able to recover. And it turned out that the policy system just didn't see them. They didn't understand the housing that they lived in. And then I went out to look at the research, and the research is virtually silent on this housing type. Aha, something to work on. So just a quick, for those of you who aren't comfortable with talking about mobile homes, just a quick primer. When we say mobile and manufactured housing, there's some technical differences between those, but we're referring to a whole category of housing in this country. Everything from the travel trailers, the cute travel trailers of the 1950s, the single wides that many of you have seen probably around, the single wides of the 1990s, which are sort of ubiquitous in a lot of parts of the country, and today's manufactured housing that are often quite nice. This is what's called a cross-mod home. It's actually pretty hard to distinguish from a stick-built home in many places. This is all kind of referred to as mobile and manufactured housing. So why should you care about it? Well, first of all, it's where a lot of people live. About 18 million people in this country live in mobile and manufactured housing. It's about 6% of the housing stock. It's also one of the fastest growing housing types in the Sun Belt states, which are the fastest growing states. If you're in Georgia, if you're in Texas, if you're in New Mexico, this is 20% of the housing stock that's being put in. North Carolina just became the second most number of mobile homes in the country, just surpassed California. It's also a hugely important source of affordable housing that's naturally occurring. This is housing that's affordable by virtue of its design and where it's located. So this is folks who don't live in a public housing project. They don't live with renter assistance. They're living in naturally occurring affordable housing, which means that losing this stuff means we have a whole lot more people who need assisted housing because we're not building it at this cost anymore. And then finally, you should care about it because a lot of it's in mobile home parks, which are its own unique challenge. These are businesses that people open where they rent you a piece of land for your home. And you put your home that you own, but you rent the land underneath. And if you're from India, where I did all my research before, this idea of owning your home and not owning the land is totally normal in informal settlements. 50% of the housing stock is that way. In the US, this is really unknown. Almost everyone thinks of homes as rented or owned. In these places, you both own your home and rent your home at the same time. It's a very weird mix-up of tenures, which creates all kinds of problems for the policy environment. Like I said, huge amounts of manufactured housing in the Southeast, in very climate vulnerable states. And I'm going to skip that real quick. Okay. It's also fair, the last thing I'd say about manufactured housing, about why you should care about it, is it's very prone to disasters by virtue of the fact that we put this stuff in a lot of cheap land. When we were doing a lot of racist and exclusionary housing policy, we would tuck the poor folks away in the floodplain. And then we created a bunch of rules that doesn't allow it anywhere else but the floodplain. So stuff is sort of locked into hazardous areas. And there's also a really huge cultural stigma around manufactured housing as unsafe from disasters. So it's this sort of perfect intersection of affordable housing and disaster risk that speaks to the kind of policy that I want to work on. And I already talked about these studies. We see disaster after disaster, we see journalists covering this, but we don't see a lot of good basic research on what the dynamics of this is, what the issues are, how should policymakers respond. So we've been doing some work, some sort of, prior to joining Urban, I'd done some very focused in specific studies of place. what are the conditions around Houston, for example. We mapped all the mobile home parks in Houston, which has never been done before, because you can't look up where mobile home parks are. They aren't counted in the census. There's nobody who has a map of them all. You have to go create your own maps. And so we mapped 3,000 mobile home parks and looked at their impacts from Harvey. But there's no national numbers about mobile home parks, and disasters. And so we just published a report where we tried to provide some national data. And the numbers are pretty shocking. I mean, we knew they would be shocking, but they're really shocking. And I can't get into the details of this is using, we're using the National Risk Index, and we're looking at sort of counties that are in the top 20% of all risk from a hazard, how many manufactured homes are in those same counties. But close to 5 million mobile homes are in the top tier of all tornado at-risk counties in the country. 3.5 million homes are in wildfire-prone areas, which is, we talk a lot about mobile homes and tornadoes, a lot about mobile homes and floods, but it turns out that wildfires are actually a huge issue as well, that we're probably not nearly talked about enough. And on down the line, we have a lot of manufactured housing in places with a lot of hazard risk. We knew that already, but it's good to confirm that. And what's also really important about this story is that we're continuing to put new manufactured housing into these same places. We also, in this report, we talk a lot about manufactured housing has changed a lot over time. And so it's really problematic that we're talking about mobile homes all the way to current manufactured homes in the same conversation. They're actually very different challenges. And we hone in a lot on what are called pre-1976 mobile homes. These are the ones that existed before HUD started regulating them. These are homes that were never designed to be around 50 years later. And these are really the highest concentration of risk in terms of poverty, social vulnerability, but as well as hazard risk is really in these pre-1976 places. And as far as we know, no one had ever put a number on how many of these pre-76 homes are still out there. And through our analysis, we're showing that about 1.25 million of these homes are still out in the US. Somewhere around 3 to 4 million Americans are still living in them. And these are places that are really not fit for habitation anymore. And the numbers, you see a lot of them in places like California and Florida, but also places like North Carolina and Pennsylvania. And so what's the actual moment that we're in right now that we can respond to with this? Well, it turns out that mobile and manufactured housing is a really interesting and popular bipartisan issue. People on the left care a lot about housing affordability in this moment, and they care a lot about people who are living in housing that have severe financial needs, right? And so people who live in mobile and manufactured housing that are at 40% of area median income or 50% of area median income, which is one of the hardest groups to reach with housing supports, many of them do live in mobile and manufactured housing. Disproportionate number of people who are elderly and disabled, the disproportionate number of Latino families live in manufactured housing. There's a constituency there for people who care a lot about supportive policy environments or supportive housing policy. Conservatives also care a lot about manufactured housing because there's a lot of mobile and manufactured housing in rural areas all around the country, and a lot of the factories that build this stuff are located in rural and red counties and states. And so suddenly in this moment right now, you see this bipartisan consensus around we need to improve housing prices, right? I think during the debate they said something about getting people out of Ohio and that's how you would make, but I think since then they've moderated that. But one of the things that a lot of Republicans have been saying is we can build more manufactured housing. That's a way to add to supply now without subsidizing it from the federal level. So that works for conservatives. And on the Democratic side, they're saying all housing supply is good. Right, the YIMBY, Yes in My Backyard movement, right? Get as much housing supply out there as possible. That's what brings down prices. Suddenly there's a lot of folks who are combined and interested in manufactured housing in this moment. We're trying to sneak in the climate resilience part. They're not talking as much about that, but I think it's part and parcel of that. How can we make sure as we ramp up production of manufactured housing, we're doing it in a way that's as resilient as possible to climate and disasters? One piece of legislation to keep your eye on right now is the Road to Housing Act that was just passed out of committee unanimously in the Senate. A big part of that has to do with manufactured housing. And I won't go into the gory details right now, but the removal of the chassis requirement is like one of the greatest moments potentially for housing innovation in this country in 50 years. It basically would potentially unlock our ability to do modular housing at scale and to bypass local building codes, which tend to be exclusionary towards manufactured housing. So we get kind of a twofer. We can build a lot more factory housing and we get by NIMBYs who don't want manufactured housing in their community at all. And it's potentially a chance to leverage both of those at the same time. There's also some really interesting things happening over in the House along the same lines, but that is more related to how we finance manufactured housing. And again, that's one of the biggest barriers to manufactured housing is treated as personal property and not real estate. And this is also a barrier to resiliency we've identified. And so a lot of work on reforming how we treat manufactured housing, giving those people access to conventional lending, which is if you want to borrow money to improve your house to make it more climate resilient, like all of us would, people living in a mobile home can't. They can't borrow against their home the way you could if you live in a house that has land underneath it. They're creating some new mechanisms where they might be able to do that and therefore replace the roof, right? Elevate their utilities, all these other normal things you might do to make your house more resilient. So it's sort of a win-win-win, and who knows? It turns out that Congress might actually do something, the president might sign it, and 2026 I think is going to be a very big year, not just for the FEMA Act and FEMA reform, but also for housing reform. And these are two areas that I think all of us who care about this stuff have a chance to really impact policy through our research. Okay, before I end, it's very cheesy, but I'm going to plug my Substack. I do write about all this stuff. We were talking earlier about like what can I when I joined a think tank, I think a lot about how can I be helpful to my former colleagues at the university. One of the ways is I get paid to pay attention to policy, and so I can write about policy and make it accessible. And so I have a Substack that I publish on every week at andrewrumbach@substack.com. But otherwise, I'm happy to answer questions about any of this stuff or anything else as well. The FEMA Reform Act?
Yeah, I was unaware of that.
Ooh. Okay. It is a big deal. I'm going to do this in a minute. I will say it comes out of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, which has the Stafford Act, and the staff there. They talk to, I think, over 100 stakeholders, including urban. They've talked to a lot of folks. So it is drawing a lot of evidence, and it goes across the entire site. So it goes from response to response, recovery, public assistance, individual assistance, mitigation. It covers the whole gamut of reforms. If I had to summarize a few key themes, one is turning FEMA from a organization that you have to get reimbursed from to an organization that gives you grants to do your stuff, which is huge for state and local governments that are always on the hook for like having to borrow money to rebuild stuff and then get reimbursed through this painful process. It speeds up the time at which FEMA has to respond and give money, like 60 days or 90 days versus years right now. So a lot of stuff around that is sort of improving the flow of dollars. It has really big reforms around housing. It allows FEMA to directly repair and rebuild housing when it's cost effective to do so, which they've never been allowed to do before. They experimented with it in American Samoa in 2013. I was there for that, and they got raked over the coals for it. And they have this weird thing where they'll pay you $100,000 to live in a hotel while you make $50,000 in repairs to your house. It's been this weird system, but I think opens up some real opportunities for improving housing recovery. It changes the pre-disaster mitigation fund into a formula grant, gets rid of BRIC, turns into a formula grant. Across the whole board, it puts in extra weight on whether you're a rural community or you're an economically distressed community, which is an interesting bipartisan moment I think we're seeing. There's some overlap between those two, but I think we see some more of like the sort of urban social progressives and the conservative Republicans coming together on that point. There's some really good stuff there on research. We're actually directing FEMA to do some studies of the actual value of hazard mitigation investments, which has been a huge problem forever, is we spend all this money on mitigation and no one can tell you if it works. And like, we require everyone to make a mitigation plan and no one can tell you if they actually do anything or have any effect whatsoever on the real world. It's like the definition of government sort of nonsense. A whole bunch of other stuff. I summarized it all in the Substack, but it's really worth, that's one thing I would love to see more people do, is take pieces of this and write about what it would mean in the real world. They've described, the staff members I've talked to describe it as like a lot of ideas. And big ideas in there don't actually have a ton of evidence behind them. They think they do, and they have a lot of like anecdotal evidence, but they would love to see more, because there's gonna be big debate and big reform probably gonna happen to the bill, but I think this is the vehicle that FEMA reform is gonna move through, if I had to guess.
Thanks. Sorry, so what extent are private insurance markets part of the cause behind lack of resiliency? And I'm curious, do you see that as an important or promising area for public policy intervention, or not necessarily?
For the last year, my go-to response has been, I don't know enough about insurance to talk about it. Talk to an insurance expert, which I'll stay with that statement. But obviously hugely important. But insurance is regulated at the state level. And I think I think it's like land use policy, where there's a few things that federal government can do, but I think honestly it's a state by state issue. And I think that insurance companies are really smart, and they have a lot of really good people, and they have a lot of really good data that they don't share with any of us. But they're driven by a different set of calculations than what they're trying to, they need to return a profit on what they do eventually, right? And they should be a real force for resiliency. And they're trying to be in certain interesting ways through the community disaster resilience zones and through some of that legislation. But that doesn't mean their job is not to be a force for social good, right? I think that's the case with any private company, right? So I think they clearly have a huge role to play, and politically they play they listen to insurance people before they listen to any of us. I guarantee you that, until we have a lobby that makes sense. So I think it's all about finding what are the areas of smart alignment. I was going to talk about it today, and I decided to swap out a different project, but we've been doing a bunch of work on, we're trying to model, take places zoning codes and show them whether their zoning code is like a hindrance or a complement to building more resiliently. And so it's a pretty complex task where we're using data on thousands and thousands of parcels and trying to show where your zoning code may be prohibitive of good development decisions. And we did a presentation on that. This is a collaboration with the National Zoning Atlas. And somebody from an insurance company called and said, hey, we'd love to talk to you about this, and we're going to do a webinar in the spring. And they're all actuarials. They're going to present their own part, but they're like, oh, insurers are caring more about zoning because they don't want to lose all their stuff. It's bad for them to have disasters happen to their properties. At a certain level, they do want good policy to build resiliently because then they don't have to pay out. They're just not going to be the ones who are they're going to drive that forward in the same way. I think they think more about levers like changing coverage rules or withdrawing from markets, right? They don't think about trying to influence local zoning codes. But in this instance, they are trying to broaden the conversation to talk with land use planners more. And I think that that's at least an example that there's appetite for all this. I'm sure if you're interested in insurance, you already know about Carolyn Kowski and Insurance for Good, this organization that she started. But I think paying attention to her and what through that organization, a lot about how can we use insurance as a key lever for resiliency, and a lot of interesting ideas about how federal partnership might work for this. Certain states love to work with the federal government on this stuff. Other states want nothing to do with it. And I think that's kind of the world we live in. I don't know how to decide when there's multiple hands up. I have to defer. We'll go this way. Start with you.
Great talk. I was interested in hearing more about what you have to say of the role of trust in government and trust in media in your work. In particular, the first project, I was wondering if you measured trust in government in the household survey, and in the second project, how you account for kind of the decentralized trust in media landscape and how to get information out during a disaster.
That's a really great questions. Yes, on the first project, we do ask a lot of questions about, we do some standard validated questions on, one's about trust and one's about does my government care about me or something like that. And we find in general that these are communities that are fairly well off, largely home, right? Pretty high on those metrics. Where you saw a huge erosion is in the community that had the enormous fight about building codes. And they felt like the government was trying to impose new energy codes on them. And you saw trust in government fall 20% in 6 months. So that, I think, there's probably something really interesting there about they're very much willing. They see government as the vehicle for positive change. They just have a particular opinions about what kind of change is appropriate in the post-disaster environment. I think the big takeaway for me from that study, one of the big takeaways is Boulder County did these changes to their land use code 10 years ago, and the public didn't oppose it at all. Everyone has to rebuild to these new standards, and they did not have protests in the streets. And when you ask them why, they say, well, we have all these contractors who now know how to build to that code. The people are comfortable with this code because it's been around. The whole thing is do this before, not after. Like, don't try to change your land use codes afterwards. It's the worst time. Even in the most climate progressive community, you're going to run into a buzzsaw of public opposition. Do this stuff before. So yes, those windows of opportunity open, but only around certain issues. And I think that that's part of it. On the trust in media, we're not trying to provide information to people, residents, during this, and we're very clear about that. We're not doing like response communication. What we're trying to, we have a sort of theory of, okay, who are it's kind of a cheesy word, but we call them change makers. Like, who are the change makers in this ecosystem? Media is part of it, elected officials and local government part of it. In a more like a complex environment, there might be like nonprofits or other churches or whatever, right, that shape the media. And we're trying to basically outreach to them with good data and evidence and let them use the information we're providing to in their own ways. And so it's very hard to measure the impact of this stuff, right? That's the challenge. Like, we did a piece 2 weeks ago on Katrina at 20. And all we did was we published like 30 visualizations of data on Katrina, the Gulf Coast, all 5 states since Hurricane Katrina, on all of these different dimensions of data. How much public assistance money have they gotten per capita? How much, like, all this disaster related data. And the theory is we just put it out there and make it known, and people are going to use that data and then it'll make their own work a little bit better with it. And so we have all these people who've written to us and said, oh, this was really helpful. I used it to do this or that. But we don't have any real, so I think that kind of fits in the disaster rapid response. All we can go on is that people still pay attention somewhat to media. We haven't come up with an influencer strategy, which is something we've talked about, but there's not really like a disaster influencer world in the same way. There's probably an opportunity there. That's the kind of stuff we're still in the infancy of it, but we would like to think more about how do we, like, beyond the traditional media outlets, how do we actually get this data and evidence into the hands of more people so they're gonna go on their podcast and talk about Los Angeles no matter what. It sure would be better if they knew that 27% of those people were renters. Not everybody in the Palisades is rich. But after the disaster, what was the narrative? Everybody's rich in the Palisades. The Palisades has, 27, there was a mobile home park in the Palisades. That kind of stuff is like, how do we make sure that, but it's such a challenging environment right now with the fracturing that we need to think through more how we get there.
So I think we'll wrap it up there for today.
Can we do one more?
Well,
I feel so bad.
Take them up in the front.
Okay.
We can chat
Sorry.
Afterwards. You want to chat
Yeah,
individually
for sure.
afterwards? So I just want to thank everybody for coming, and please let's give one round of applause for you.
Thank you.